Evan Blake pulled into his driveway just after 5, the sun hanging low over the rooftops of Willow Glen. It had been a long date, too many emails, too many phone calls, but he was finally home. His modest 2-story house sat beneath the shade of a towering oak tree that had stood guard in his front yard since he was a teenager. The tree, with its broad limbs and weathered bark, had been there longer than most of the neighbors. He smiled at it like an old friend. As he climbed out of his car, something caught his eye. A white envelope was taped to his front door, not the mailbox, not tucked under the mat. Taped neatly, deliberately, right in the center. Evan tugged it free and flipped it over. The return address read, Willow Glen Homeowners Association. He sighed. That usually meant one thing: someone wasn't happy. Inside. The letter was short and direct. Dear Mr. Blake, this is an official notice regarding the tree located in your front yard, adjacent to the sidewalk. After routine inspection and multiple resident concerns, it has been determined that the tree poses a safety risk due to its size and location. You are hereby requested to have the tree removed within 7 days from the date of this notice. Failure to comply may result in fines and further HOA action. Sincerely, Karen Dillard, President, Willow Glen HOA. Vaughn read the letter twice. Then, a third time, the tree. His tree. That couldn't be right. He looked up at the giant oak, its limbs gently rustling in the evening breeze. Sure, a few leaves had started falling early this year, but it looked healthy, strong even. Last year, an arborist had told him it would probably live another 50 years if left alone. This has to be a mistake, he muttered. But he already knew better. Karen Dillard had lived in Willow Glen for just 3 years, but she'd been elected HOA president almost immediately after moving in. No one else wanted the job, and Karen took it seriously. She was the type who noticed if your recycling bin was out 10 minutes too late, or if your shutters were slightly off color from the original design guidelines. Most residents chose to keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention. Evan, however, had never had any major run-ins with her until now. He folded the letter slowly and walked back to his car, opening the glove box and sliding the envelope inside. For a moment, he just sat there in silence, watching the branches sway above him. The tree wasn't just part of his yard. It was part of his memory. He remembered planting it with his father one spring afternoon, muddy hands and all. They had dug the hole together, arguing about how deep it should go, laughing when the root ball fell apart mid-transfer. His dad had called it Blake Family Tree Number 1. It wasn't just sentimental. It was personal. Evan stepped out of the car again, this time walking around the base of the tree. He looked for any signs of decay. Nothing obvious. No hollow trunk. No fungus. No heavy lean toward the sidewalk. He even checked the roots. They were thick and healthy. From everything he could see, the tree was fine. That night, he made tea and sat out on the porch beneath the canopy of leaves. A soft breeze moved through the branches, and acorns occasionally dropped to the lawn like tiny reminders that nature still had its own rhythm. He knew he couldn't ignore the letter, but something about it didn't sit right. 7 days. That's all he had. Evan took a sip of tea, glanced at the tree once more, and made a quiet promise to himself. He wasn't going to lose it without a fair conversation, not this time. Every morning at exactly 8 a.m., Karen Dillard pulled out of her driveway in a shiny red convertible that caught the sunlight like a mirror. It was spotless always. Not a streak on the windshield, not a leaf out of place on the soft-top roof. Even when the rest of the street was coated in pollen. Karen believed a clean car said something important about a person, just like a clean neighborhood. That's why she took her job as president of the Willow Glen Homeowners Association so seriously. It wasn't just a volunteer position to Karen. It was a responsibility, a mission. And most days that mission began with a slow, careful drive through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand. She didn't see it as spying. She called it visual compliance monitoring. It's a fancy way of saying she looked for things that didn't match the HOA guidelines. Mailboxes leaning at odd angles, flower beds with the wrong kind of mulch, fences in need of painting or porch, lights that hadn't been replaced. She had a whole checklist she updated every few months. And today, right in the middle of her route, was Evan Blake's front yard. She slowed her convertible to a near crawl, tapping the brakes as she approached. The tall oak tree that now had a yellow caution ribbon tied around its trunk, courtesy of the HOA landscaper, who had visited the day before. Karen squinted through her oversized sunglasses and clicked her pen against the clipboard. "The lean is worse," she said softly, though no one else was around. "And it's definitely spreading leaves onto the sidewalk." From her point of view, that was all she needed. Safety first. That was her motto, printed right at the top of every HOA bulletin. Even a tree with deep roots could become a hazard if the wind picked up or if branches started breaking off during storms. It was better to be proactive. That's what she always told the board. She reached into the passenger seat, pulled out her phone, and took a photo of the tree from 3 angles, just in case. Across the street, Evan watched from behind his window. He wasn't surprised to see Karen. She came by almost every day now. And each time she stayed a little longer in front of his house. He could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, imagining all the improvements she thought he needed to make. This time, he decided to say something. He stepped outside, careful to keep his tone polite. "Morning, Karen," he called out. Karen looked up and smiled as if surprised to see him. "Oh, good morning, Evan. Just doing a quick check around the neighborhood. Nothing unusual, right?" he said, glancing at the tree. "You know, I had that oak checked by a professional arborist last year. Said it was healthy, strong roots, no signs of disease." Karen nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but trees can change fast, especially with the weather we've had. It's better to be safe than sorry, don't you think?" "I agree," Evan said, "but removing a tree that's been here 20 years, that should be a big decision, not just one person's opinion." Karen's smile thinned just slightly. "That's why we have the board. And the board agreed with my recommendation after reviewing the photos. We're just trying to keep the community looking its best." Evan folded his arms but stayed calm. "I understand that. But I think the neighborhood is more than just checklists and symmetry." Karen blinked. "Well, that's a nice sentiment," she said, her voice still pleasant. "But rules are rules. You have a few days left before the removal deadline. Just let us know if you plan to take care of it yourself." With that, she gave a small wave, put her car into gear, and continued slowly down the street. Evan stood at the edge of the lawn, watching the taillights of the convertible until it turned the corner. The trees swayed gently above him. He reached up and touched the rough bark near the base. Something about Karen's visit had settled it for him. He wasn't going to let this go quietly. Not anymore. Evan Blake wasn't one to stir up conflict. Most of the time, he preferred the path of least resistance. Solve problems quietly, avoid drama, keep things calm. But as he sat at his kitchen table that evening, the HOA letter laid out beside his laptop and the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead, he realized something had shifted. It wasn't just about a tree anymore. He took a slow breath, sipped his coffee, and opened a folder on his computer labeled Home Docs. Inside were digital copies of every inspection, repair, and yard service he'd ever ordered. Evan was organized. He pulled up the tree report from last spring, a full evaluation from a licensed arborist, complete with photos and a clean bill of health. No structural weaknesses, no disease. Solid root structure. He read aloud. He clicked print. Over the next hour, he gathered everything he could. He took new pictures of the tree from all angles, showing how it stood tall and even, not leaning, not touching the sidewalk. He pulled out older photos, 2 ones with him and his dad freshly planting the sapling in the same spot it now stood. His dad's hand rested on his shoulder in one of them. It made Evan pause. This tree's been part of this yard longer. "Than most fences in this neighborhood," he said quietly. The next morning, Evan walked door to door not with complaints, but with calm questions. He spoke to a handful of neighbors, all longtime residents like him. "Do you think the tree's dangerous?" he asked. Mrs. Patel from across the street shook her head. "That oak's been here since my boys were in middle school. Drops. A few leaves, sure, but I've never thought of it as a problem." The Grants, who lived 2 doors down, agreed. "We park under its shade when it's hot," Mr. Grant said. "We'd hate to see it go. What's all this about?" Evan explained, showing the letter. Word spread quickly, and by afternoon, a few neighbors had already posted gentle comments on the community board, questioning whether tree removal was necessary. No one was angry, just confused. Evan typed up a respectful appeal, attached the arborist's report, the supporting photos, and even the old snapshot of him and his dad planting the tree. He added signatures from 7 neighbors who said they wanted the tree to stay. He ended the letter with a simple request. "I understand the board has concerns. I respect the work the HOA does to keep Willow Glen beautiful. But this tree is healthy, well-maintained, and important to many of us here. I ask that the board reconsider the removal order and give the matter further review. Thank you for your time and fairness." He hand-delivered the envelope to the HOA drop box on Maple Avenue, then went home feeling cautiously hopeful. 3 days later, he got the response. It was brief, no more than a page. The board, it said, had reviewed his materials at the most recent meeting. However, they determined that the original order still stood. The tree would need to be removed by the following Wednesday, or the HOA would arrange for removal and apply any associated costs to the homeowner's account. At the bottom, Kieran Dillard's signature was neatly printed in bold. Evan read the letter twice and sat back in his chair, the same way he had a week earlier. But this time, the feeling was different. His appeal had been thoughtful, respectful, backed by expert opinion and neighbor support. Still, it hadn't mattered. Out his window, the tree stood tall and steady, its branches moving gently in the afternoon breeze. Evan felt the familiar spark of something he rarely let surface. Determination, not frustration, not anger, just a deep sense of what was right. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. Next, but he knew this wasn't over Wednesday. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp summer air that made Willow Glen feel like a postcard. The sun was bright, the birds were loud, and the only thing missing from the picture was the peace. At exactly 8:13 a.m., a large white truck with orange lettering rumbled onto Evan Blake Street. The side read, "Safe Cut Tree Services. Professional, insured, efficient." It parked directly in front of Evan's home, just beneath the oak tree that had caused so much recent discussion. 2 workers hopped out, both in matching reflective vests. SAN began unloading chainsaws, ropes, and hard hats from the truck bed. Evan watched from the front window, mug of coffee in hand. He had hoped the HOA might have a change of heart. But here they were, right on schedule. He stepped outside, not to argue, but to be present. "Morning." One of the workers said, polite but focused, "We're here to remove the tree. HOA sent us, you the homeowner." Evan nodded. "I am. Just so you know, I didn't authorize this." The man looked at his clipboard and gave a small shrug. "We were told it's an HOA order. We've got the paperwork. It's just following instructions." Evan didn't blame the workers. They were just doing a job. Still, he took out his phone and began quietly recording. Not for drama, but for documentation. Just in case by 8:45 they'd begun the prep work. One worker used a pole saw to trim smaller branches. Another circled the base, planning where the main trunk would fall. Across the street, a familiar red convertible eased to a stop. Karen Dillard stepped out in her usual pressed blouse and wide sunglasses. She carried a clipboard, as always, and wore a smile that suggested this was simply another task being completed to keep the neighborhood running smoothly. She didn't wave to Evan. She didn't need to. Instead, Shu took her place near the sidewalk and watched like an event organizer checking her list. Evan remained on the front steps, arms crossed. He had tried every reasonable path appeals. Reports. Neighbor support, but now the decision was out of his hands. A few neighbors gathered nearby. Mrs. Patel watched quietly from her porch with a disapproving frown. The Grants stood at their driveway, arms around each other. People weren't shouting or protesting. They were simply present. Bearing witness that by 9 o'clock, the top third of the tree had been trimmed. One worker tied a heavy-duty rope to the thickest branch while the other started the base cut with a chainsaw. The hum filled the street. Evan noticed something, then something subtle. The wind, which had been still earlier, had started to pick up. Not wildly, just enough to make the leaves rustle harder and shift the tree's weight unpredictably. "Watch the angle," said one worker to the other. Karen stepped a little closer to the curb. Her convertible parked directly across from the tree, engine off, top down. Evan walked toward the workers, careful not to get in the way. "Hey, it might be a good idea to hold off for a second. The wind's picking up." The lead cutter shook his head. "We're good. Got control lines. Should drop straight onto the lawn." But within moments, it became clear something was off. The wind gusted again, stronger this time. The top of the tree swayed farther than expected. The cut was already too deep to stop. One worker pulled the rope sharply to guide the trunk down. But the wind had other plans. The oak gave a final loud crack, and then it fell not toward the open lawn, but twisting just enough to shift its path. Karen barely had time to react. The heavy trunk came down at an angle, landing with a thunderous crash directly across the hood and windshield of her red convertible. The metal folded with a deep groan, the windshield shattered into 1,000 gleaming pieces. A moment of stunned silence, followed broken only by the sound of a rogue acorn bouncing across the sidewalk. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard now at her feet. Evan slowly lowered his phone. Still recording, no one said a word. The tree was down, but the real fallout had only just begun. By noon, the oak tree was gonna sawed into thick grounds and hauled away in the back of the contractor's truck. All that remained was a wide stump, a few scattered leaves, and the unmistakable silence of a neighborhood still processing what had just happened. Karen's red convertible, however, remained exactly where it had landed in fate's path. The trunk had been lifted off carefully, but the damage was undeniable. The hood was crushed. The front windshield was a web of broken glass. The leather interior had taken a hit from falling branches, and acorns were still hiding in the creases. Of the seats, the workers packed up quietly, apologizing one last time before driving off. Evan stood in the driveway, arms crossed, as neighbors slowly approached, with pitchforks or judgment. But with genuine curiosity, "I've lived on this street for 26 years, said Mr. Grant, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like that. I warned her," Mrs. Patel added softly, glancing at the crushed car. "That tree was rooted deep. It just needed to be left alone." Evan gave a small shrug. "I did what I could. Sent the report, spoke to the board. After that, it was out of my hands." Later that afternoon, a tow truck arrived to take Karen's convertible to a local repair shop. She didn't come outside this time. She watched from behind her curtains as her once pristine car was pulled onto the flatbed and taken away. By early evening, word had spread beyond Willow Glen. Someone had taken a video, likely one of the teens down the block, and posted it to a local community forum with the caption, "HOA tree takedown goes very wrong in Willow Glen." By the next morning, the post had hundreds of comments. Some offered sympathy for Karen. Others debated the rights of HOAs and whether homeowners should have more say. But most responses circled around one theme. Why was a healthy tree removed in the first place? Evan scrolled through the comments on his phone while sipping his morning coffee. He hadn't asked for the attention, but the situation had struck a nerve. People didn't just care about the tree. They cared about how decisions were made and who got to make them. Later that day, a letter appeared in Evan's mailbox. One wasn't from the HOA, but from Karen herself. It was typed, folded neatly, and unsigned. Dear Mr. Blake, I regret the unfortunate circumstances of yesterday's events. I ask that we refrain from sharing further material regarding the incident online or with other residents. It would be best for all involved to move forward calmly and with dignity. Please note that any personal video, footage, or photos should remain private to avoid any legal misunderstandings or misinterpretations. Respectfully, concerned neighbor Evan read the letter twice. Then he looked at the small stack of papers he'd already gathered his arborist report. The appeal he submitted. Even a note from the contractor stating the HOA had ordered the job without prior consent from the homeowner. He didn't need to post anything. The story was already out there. But what surprised him most wasn't the accident or even the video going viral. It was the way his neighbors had responded. People were talking, not complaining, but really talking, asking questions, sharing stories of other odd HOA decisions over the years. Suddenly, the oak tree wasn't just about leaves and roots. It was about something deeper. How much say residents actually had in their own yards, their own homes, their own lives. That night, Evan took a walk. The stump in his front yard had already begun to darken, the wood exposed to air for the first time in decades. He placed a smooth river rock on top, a small tribute, and stood quietly beneath the stars. A surprising twist. Yes, but maybe not. The end. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. For the first time since she became HOA president, Karen Dillard stayed inside. She wasn't seen on her morning drive. No clipboard, no convertible. No slow pass down the street with her usual wave. Her house usually pristine with its flower beds in perfect symmetry. Had the curtains drawn for 2 days straight? Whispers began circulating among the neighbors. Some thought she was embarrassed. Others wondered if she was simply regrouping. But whatever the reason, her sudden silence was louder than her usual presence. Evan Blake didn't expect an apology. He wasn't even sure he wanted one, but part of him was still unsettled. Despite how everything had unfolded, he didn't feel triumphant. It felt like something had snapped in the rhythm of the neighborhood, and no one quite knew how to put it back together. On the third day after the tree incident, Evan was returning from the grocery store when he spotted Karen in her yard. She wasn't dressed in her usual business casual blouse or heels. Instead, she wore sneakers and gardening gloves, kneeling beside her front hedge with a small rake. She looked up and saw him. They locked eyes for a brief moment. To Evan's surprise, she stood and waved. He hesitated, then crossed the street. "Morning," he said carefully. "Hello, Evan." Her voice was softer than usual, without the edge it often carried in meetings or memos. They stood in an awkward pause. She looked tired. Nothing dramatic, just slightly deflated. Not defeated, but no longer standing quite as tall. "I wanted to say," she began, brushing her gloves together, "about everything that happened. I didn't expect it to end that way." "Obviously, no one did," Evan replied. "But I did try to warn the board." Karen nodded slowly. "Yes, you did, and you were right. I've been thinking about that." He said nothing, letting her continue. "When I joined the HOA, I thought I was helping. I've worked in management my whole life. I like things too. Be orderly, predictable. I thought people appreciated that." She looked down at the rake in her hand, then back up. "But I think I stopped listening." Evan tilted his head. "You're not the only one who cares about this neighborhood. Karen, we all live here. Most of us just want a little balance." She gave a half smile, the first real one he'd seen from her in weeks. "You know, after the video started making rounds, I got a call from someone on the city council. They wanted to know if our HOA had a safety process in place for removals. I didn't have a good answer. That's how change starts," Evan said. "By asking better questions. Karen looked at the stump in his yard, still visible from her side of the street. "I know the tree meant something to you," she said quietly. "It did," Evan answered. "But what it meant to everyone else after it fell was unexpected." I nodded. "I suppose not all damage is bad. Times it clears space for something better." Evan raised an eyebrow. "You thinking of planting something?" Karen gave a thoughtful shrug. "Maybe, but I think the board needs new roots before the landscaping does." That surprised him. Later that week, a notice was sent out to all residents. Karen had called for a special meeting to open the floor for community input, and even nominations for board elections ahead of schedule. For the first time in years, almost every household showed up. People brought lawn chairs. One brought cookies. It felt more like a block party than a board meeting. Karen opened the discussion, not with rules, but with a question. "What kind of neighborhood do you want Willow Glen to be?" No clipboards. No checklists. Just a quiet willingness to listen. And Evan, watching from the second row, realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes the strongest things in a neighborhood aren't rooted in the ground. They're built in the moments when people finally start talking and hearing each other. The night of the special meeting, the Willow Glen Community Center buzzed with an energy Evan hadn't felt in years. The usual stiff, formal atmosphere of HOA meetings had given way to a room filled with genuine curiosity and hope. The old gymnasium smelled faintly of popcorn and fresh paint, and rows of folding chairs were nearly all taken. Karen Dillard stood at the front, looking calmer and more approachable than anyone remembered. Instead of a stack of papers or a rigid agenda she held a simple notepad and smiled gently as people settled in. The microphone crackled to life. "Good evening, everyone," Karen began. "Thank you all for coming. This meeting isn't about rules or violations, it's about listening. I want to hear your thoughts, your ideas, and your concerns about this neighborhood and how we can move forward together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Evan found a seat near the back but leaned forward. Interested in how this would unfold? People who rarely spoke at meetings were raising their hands. Stories were shared, a couple explaining why they loved the large trees for shade. A young family expressing excitement for safer sidewalks. A retiree asking for more community events. Karen listened carefully, taking notes and nodding. When someone spoke about the recent tree removal, she didn't defend the decision or justify the board's past actions. Instead, she acknowledged the mistake and expressed a sincere desire to improve the process moving forward. At one point, Mrs. Patel spoke up, her voice steady but warm. "I've lived here 30 years. This neighborhood has always been special. Because people care. It's time we remember that caring means listening more than deciding." The room filled with soft applause when the conversation shifted to the board itself. Karen surprised everyone by inviting nominations for new members, encouraging anyone interested to step forward. It was a gesture that felt like fresh air, inviting the community into the decision-making circle rather than keeping it closed off. Evan watched as several neighbors raised their hands, including a few younger faces he hadn't seen involved before. It felt like a turning point. After the meeting, small groups formed near the exits, discussing plans for neighborhood gardens, block parties, and even a monthly newsletter. Karen stayed behind for a while, chatting quietly with residents. No longer the distant authority figure, but one of them. On his way home, Evan thought about the change unfolding before him. What had started with a tree and a letter had grown into something bigger, a chance to rebuild trust. It wasn't just about one tree anymore. It was about how a community could come together, even after disagreements, to find common ground. As he walked past the empty stump in his front yard, Evan smiled. Maybe someday soon, that spot would bloom again, not just with new leaves, but with fresh ideas and stronger roots. The weeks after the special meeting felt like a fresh breeze sweeping through Willow Glen. Conversations that had been quiet whispers in front yards and online forums now turned into action plans. The neighborhood was coming alive in a way it hadn't in years. Evan Blake. Once just a quiet homeowner trying to save his tree, found himself volunteering for the newly formed Neighborhood Renewal Committee. The committee's first order of business, planning a community tree planting day. The spot where the old oak had stood was now marked with a simple wooden sign that read, "Future Home of a New Beginning." Evan stood beside it one Saturday morning, greeting neighbors arriving with saplings, gardening gloves, and smiles. Karen Dillard appeared, too, not in her usual crisp attire, but wearing jeans and a wide-brimmed hat. She carried a small shovel and a few bags of mulch ready to dig in. "Good to see you here," Evan said as she approached. Karen smiled, brushing dirt from her gloves. "It's good to be part of something that feels right." The morning air was filled with laughter and chatter. Children ran between houses, helping carry watering cans and tossing acorns into collection buckets. Elderly neighbors shared stories about the trees they remembered from decades past. And young families talked about the importance of shade and fresh air as they worked. Evan reflected on how far they'd come. The tree removal had sparked frustration and confusion. But it had also sparked change that couldn't have happened without honest conversations and a willingness to listen. Karen knelt beside a small sapling, carefully positioning its roots in the freshly dug hole. She looked up at Evan and said, "This feels different, more hopeful." "It is," Evan agreed. "We're growing something better, not just trees, but trust." By afternoon, several saplings had found new homes along the street. The community had agreed to tend to them together, watering and caring for their growth. It wasn't just about replacing what was lost. It was about planting a future where everyone had a voice. The new HOA board election followed soon after, with fresh faces joining the team, residents who had never considered themselves leaders, but now stepped up with enthusiasm and ideas. Karen chose to step down, passing the baton with grace. She left behind a neighborhood that had rediscovered its heart. On his front porch that evening, Evan looked out over the street, bathed in the golden light of sunset. The stump was gone, replaced by the small sapling they had planted earlier that day. Its leaves fluttered gently in the breeze, reaching toward the sky as if promising growth and renewal. Neighbors were chatting across fences, sharing gardening tips and plans for an upcoming block party. The air smelled faintly of fresh earth and possibility. Evan smiled. This was more than a story about a tree or a vehicle. It was about what happens when people come together, when they choose understanding over conflict, community over division. And as the sapling took root in the soil, so too did something new in Willow Glen. A neighborhood growing together, stronger and more united than ever before.